All right, so we've set the stage. We understand the basics of monetary policy. We understand how Ben Bernanke was, you know, revolutionary during the financial crisis and had all these new tools. Then COVID hits. The first thing that happens with COVID, right? I was teaching macroeconomics, and the Fed met outside of its regularly scheduled time, right? It like met in some random day in the middle of March and cut interest rates to zero. So that's the first thing. It's just, okay, they're using the traditional tools super aggressively. Reserve requirements, zero, okay? But then they just start doing all this other stuff. It's crazy. So, new as of 2020. This is going to take a while, and just to be clear, you're not going to understand all of it. I do not understand all of this. I've given you the perusal article with it in it. Maybe between several of you, we can figure out some of these things. But as long as we start to understand it, I'm happy. Okay, first thing, buying bonds and repo markets. From what I understood, this is open market operations for longer term reasons or with a promise to sell. So this is basically like what we would call quantitative easing. The other thing, quantitative easing with many assets. Again, things like mortgage-backed securities that happened in 2008. Number 3, lending to securities firms under the primary dealer credit facility. So basically the firms get loans and they give equity or debt like bonds as collateral. They did this in 2008 apparently and needed permission from the Treasury Secretary to reinstate. Provided help with money market funds. So if you guys have like investments through Vanguard, your money goes into a money market fund. It's like a checking account, but it's not FDIC insured. So basically the Fed was targeting these money market funds since investors have taken these out. So basically, let's see here. They're providing securities firms help and telling them they can sell securities to cover these. I'm at a 20% understanding with that one. All right. Temporarily relaxing the amounts banks, wow, there's a lot of typos here. Relaxing the amounts banks have to hold for regulatory reasons. So for example, I don't know if you remember this, Wells Fargo got into trouble, and my husband keeps calling me, it's super annoying. Wells Fargo got into trouble. I don't even remember why, it was doing something shady, and the Fed said, you've got restrictions on growth as sort of a punishment. COVID hits, don't worry about it, Wells Fargo. You're good to go. Don't worry about having to hold extra things for regulatory reasons. Loans through the discount window. This is the discount rate, the rate banks pay for screwing up to borrow money from the Fed. It was not just overnight. Hey, take the money for 90 days. The other thing that's super interesting is the Fed got 8 big banks to borrow from this to reduce the stigma. So like, hey, Bank of America, come do this. Hey, look, everyone, Bank of America did it. Okay, the primary market corporate credit facility. This is purchasing bonds from corporations and providing them with loans. The borrowers may defer interest and payments for 6 months so they can pay employees. So this is kind of like trying to target corporations, which the Fed usually does not do. One thing that they did is they said, hey guys, you can't pay dividends or do stock buybacks with this money. This is important because a lot of the money that banks got through the 2017 tax cuts was apparently went into stock buybacks. I read an article that said like all of it was. Don't quote me on that, but there was concern about it. All right, secondary market corporate credit facility. This is purchasing corporate bonds and ETFs supporting them. Initially supporting $100 billion in new financing, the Fed announced on April 9th a massive expansion. This is April 9th, 2020. The facilities will now backstop up to $750 billion of corporate debt. And with previous facilities, the Fed invoked Section 13 of the Federal Reserve Act and received permission from the U.S. Treasury, which provided $75 billion to cover potential losses. Commercial paper lending facility. The Fed buys commercial paper, essentially lending directly to corporations for up to 3 months, between 1 to 2 percentage points higher than overnight lending rates. Apparently it was a $1.2 trillion market. and it helped firms finance day-to-day operations along with other things. You can read all about it. The Main Street New Loan Facility and Main Street Secondary Loan Facility. So through banks, the Fed was to offer 4-year loans to businesses with up to 15,000 employees and revenues of less than $5 billion. The Fed was supposedly funding 95% and banks funded 5%. So this was targeted towards smaller companies. Again, it was subject to restrictions on dividends, executive compensation, and stock buybacks. The Paycheck Protection Program Liquidity Facility, this was meant to facilitate loans to small businesses. It had to do with the Paycheck Protection Program in the CARES Act. Term Asset-Backed Securities Loan Facilities. This lended to holders of asset-backed securities with new loans, collateralized debt obligations. So basically these loans included student loans, auto loans, credit card loans, loans guaranteed by the Small Business Association, mortgage-backed securities. This is basically the Fed trying to get more lending to households. So it's like lending to people who, like firms who held collateralized debt obligations. If you're like me and you hear collateralized debt obligations, it makes you super nervous, because that was what the financial crisis was, because of mortgage-backed securities. But basically, there's like all sorts of collateralized loan obligations, and this was the Fed trying to like lend to people who had them. Right? So you can kind of see the cartwheels the Fed has to do. It wants to get money to households. This is the best it can do. It wants to get money to businesses. It has to do kind of these weird things, and it has to get special permission from Congress or the Treasury Secretary. All right. Municipal Liquidity Facility. The Fed was going to buy municipal bonds to help cities and states get funding. Under the facility, the Fed would buy municipal bonds tied to future tax revenues with maturity under 2 years. And it also allowed municipal debt to be used as collateral for the other stuff it was doing. So basically, COVID hits, the federal government can run a deficit with the CARES Act and the subsequent stimuluses. The federal government can run debts way easier than cities can and states can. And so to help cities and states, this was the Fed trying to help them with these bonds. One thing that it came out later, though, is actually majority black cities were hurt with this. So there were these rules, right? It's tied to future tax revenues, and I think the cities had to be like a certain size. And so cities like Detroit didn't get it. And so there was this unintended consequence. All right, the Fed also lent to other central banks. They get dollars, we get foreign currency with interest. We've actually already had these lines established, but the Fed Reserve was dropping the interest rate and including other central banks and taking U.S. Treasury debt as collateral. Okay, I don't even think this is everything, because I think we set up credit swap lines with other central banks on top of it. All right, so basically the Fed does all this stuff. And the question is, will this is back in 2020, will this save the economy? No. The Fed's powers and tools, as impressive as they are, aren't sufficient to cope with the economic harm of the COVID crisis. That's why there's been a big, at least $2 trillion fiscal response from Congress and the President, support for businesses and checks to households. This was the CARES Act when this was written. That was the first one. So going back to this. Let's look at 2008. Let's look at 2020. And you can see this had a tremendous impact on the Fed's balance sheet. You can actually click on this and play around with it. Support for specific institutions, for example. You can actually see the AIG through the financial crisis. It's pretty interesting. All right, so, wow, all of this happened. In the Brookings article, which I've given you, I believe there's an update on like how much this cost, when it ended, all of this stuff. But to sum up, the Fed had a very, very aggressive expansionary policy. So there's two questions here. One is, did this cause inflation? And I think it did, right? When we're talking massive expansionary policies, I do think there's a risk of inflation. However, when the inflation happened, I believe has much more to do with the third stimulus payments, with the American Recovery Act or whatever it's called. I think that had more of an impact than the Fed Reserve stuff, because the Fed was kind of like backing off these programs by that time. With that said, one of the articles I'm giving you had to do with the inflation target. And so when I was at the American Economic Association, big annual conference that I've been talking about, one of the things that all the economists, Republican, Democrat, everyone was agreeing with is 2% is kind of a weird target. So the Fed has always said, hey, 2% core inflation, and it's actually the PCE inflation. If you look at GDP, it's personal consumption expenditures, that inflation. 2% growth in that. But everyone's like, that's weird and it's too low. We think we can have 3 or 4% inflation. And among the many reasons for this is there's not a huge cost to that level of inflation. And the benefit is that we've got more power to cut interest rates then if we head into like another recession or crisis. We don't like that our interest rates have been like so crazy low for so long. So the Fed had said it was going to allow inflation above 2% for a while. It's not like it had announced a new target, but it's like, hey, we can push it up a little above 2. So that was interesting, right? So the Fed said that that was something it was hoping to do. I do not think anyone anticipated 8.5% inflation. We had the invasion of Ukraine. We had the supply shock in the middle of it. So clearly inflation is too high. But it would be interesting to know, what the target's going to become coming out of all of this. So what is the Fed doing now? Well, I gave you guys the Federal Open Market Committee statement, and you read that for last week. Let's see where it's at. So it's very carefully worded, as all statements are. Job gains have been robust. The unemployment rate has been declining substantially. Inflation remains elevated, reflecting supply and demand imbalances. Cost push, demand pull inflation. All this wording, right? And then it gets to the third paragraph. In support of these goals, the committee decided to raise the target federal funds rate by 0.5 point. Boom, stock markets freaked out, right? So that's an aggressive move. And it's like so carefully worded in the third paragraph. And you see how it's very careful. It seeks to achieve maximum employment and inflation, getting at the dual mandate wording. In addition, the committee decided to begin reducing its holdings of Securities, and agency debt. It's going to start selling these things, and that's contractionary policy. So the Federal Reserve is pulling contractionary policy. For now, it seems pretty aggressive, which I'm actually super happy about. I think we need to control the inflation. The worry now becomes, is it going to have to send us into a recession, right? So we know we have to control the inflation. Is it going to be like the 80s where, fixing the inflation causes a recession, or are we going to be able to back out of that? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that interest rates are high, right? It's translating into mortgage rates being high and other rates like that. So, what are you doing for the rest of the week here? You're going to read through the 2 Brookings articles, and then you're going to answer a few Blackboard questions that are very short. So, hopefully you understood some of what I just said. It's one of those things. Having a class without exams allows me to teach this, right? If I was giving you exams, everyone would freak out. What is the Main Street lending facility? Oh my gosh, what's the primary credit? Blah, blah, blah. We don't have exams, so we can actually address this like really interesting thing without a whole lot of pressure. So I hope you enjoy doing that. And that's all I've got.